Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Allen, pronouns she, her, and I am one of the co-directors of the Notebooks Collective. We are a virtual literary art space focused on community, connection, and continued learning. The Notebooks Collective believes that Black Lives Matter and acknowledges that as a virtual organization, our offices are on the unceded lands of the Kickapoo, Massachusetts, and Pawtucket tribes. Native peoples across the world continue to preserve and celebrate their cultures, and we encourage you to support Native writers and artists. Since our events are attended by people all over the US, we encourage you to use this map to see what native land you live on. Becca will drop that in the chat. We know these are stressful times, and we are glad you have joined us tonight to celebrate community and these poets, because you're really in for a treat. I now welcome Becca to introduce our speakers.
Hello, everybody. Let me see here. My name is Becca. I am the other half of the Notebooks Collective, and I am really honored tonight to introduce our event, or rather pre-introduce our event. By that I mean I will introduce our moderator, the poet Ellen Austin Lee, the person who grabbed me by the arm and said, I have two poets you need to invite to the Notebooks Collective. And Lisa and I are so glad she did. When I think of Ellen's work, I think rich images, I think quiet, devastating observations, I think bees. Her work has appeared in Artemis, Thimble Literary Magazine, The Main Review, Solstice, a magazine of diverse voices, Lily Poetry Review, Rust and Moth, and other places. Finishing Line Press published her two chapbooks, Firefly in 2019 and Lockdown: Scenes from Early in the Pandemic 2021. She's a Best of Net nominee. A Martin B. Bernstein Fellowship recipient, she earned an MFA in poetry at the Solstice Low Residency program. Ellen is also a community builder. She co-founded the monthly reading series Poetry Night at Sitwell's in Cincinnati, where she lives with her husband in a newly empty nest. You can find more of her work at ellenaustinlee.me. And now I am going to turn it over to Ellen and allow her to introduce tonight's guests. Welcome, Ellen.
Thank you, Becca. Thanks for that nice introduction. And thank you, Becca and Lisa, for having this really amazing literary space. I'm excited to be here tonight. And I'm also really excited to introduce all the people that came to Pauletta Hansel and Sara Wagner, because you need to know these poets. So I'm going to start by reading their official bios and then go into something a little bit more personal about them. So Pauletta Hansel's 9 poetry collections include Heartbreak Tree, winner of the 2023 Poetry Society of Virginia's North American Book Award, and Palindrome, winner of the 2017 Weatherford Award for Appalachian Poetry. She was 2022 Writer in Residence for the Public Library of Cincinnati and Hamilton County, and Cincinnati's first Poet Laureate. Her writing has been featured in Oxford American, Rattle, Appalachian Review, Pine Mountain Sand and Gravel, American Life and Poetry, and Poetry Daily, among others. Sara Wagner is the author of 3 prize-winning full-length books of poetry. Lady Wingshot, winner of the 2022 Blue Lynx Prize, forthcoming in 2024. Swan Wife, the 2021 Cider Press Review Editors Prize, published in 2022. And Hillbilly Madonna, the 2020 Driftwood Press Manuscript Prize, also published in 2022. And she's the author of 2 chapbooks, Tumbling After from Redbird Chapbooks in 2022, a very good year for Sara Wagner, and Hooked Through 2017. She is also a 2022 Ohio Arts Council Individual Excellence Award recipient and a 2021 National Poetry Series finalist, and the recipient of a 2019 Sustainable Arts Foundation Award. Her poetry has appeared or is forthcoming in many journals and anthologies, including Gulf Coast, Six Finch, Waxwing, Beloit Poetry Journal, and the Cincinnati Review, among others. So her website is saramorewagner.com, and Pauletta's you can find with her name in The Poet's Craft. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to these two powerhouse women poets, Pauletta Hansel and Sara Moore Wagner, from the greater Cincinnati region. As you'll glean from this conversation and reading, both poets have deep roots in Appalachia. Pauletta hails from southeastern Kentucky, and Sara's family hails from West Virginia and Ohio's Appalachian region. I mention this because place and family figure prominently in both Pauletta and Sara's work. And I have to, a little aside here, I have to brag on my pronunciation of Appalachia. Pauletta will know what I'm talking about. Us Northerners say Appalachia, and I've been training myself to pronounce it like people from the southern areas of Appalachia prefer. So you'll have to tell me how I'm doing, Pauletta. So over the past 6 months, Pauletta and Sara have conducted 4 joint readings, at least, from their recent collections, Heartbreak Tree, which is Pauletta's, and Hillbilly Madonna, which is Sara's. And as each of these books, though unique to each poet's voice, communicate along the lines of place and identity. So one commonality is, as Sara said in a recent interview in the Extraordinary Times, wild girls. And speaking of interviews, besides the interview in Extraordinary Times, you can also find an excellent online interview with Pauletta and Sara in Salon by Allison Stein. It's really great about their many connections, especially around these two collections and how they relate to the region. So during the first part of the evening, we'll hear Pauletta and Sara read an excerpted section from their joint reading that they've called Girlhoods Hollers from Heartbreak Tree and Hillbilly Madonna. And then after this opening, we're going to hear more about some of their other books, their writing process, current writing projects, and some more poems from their other books. Hopefully we'll have time for some of that. So before opening our time together, I want to offer some personal comments on Pauletta and Sara. I've known Pauletta for many years now as both a participant in her many workshops and a frequent flyer at retreats she hosts for women writers in one of her sacred places, Nobbs Haven, at the Loretta Mother House in Kentucky. Not only is Pauletta a brilliant poet and essayist, but she's also an educator with a generous spirit, willing to share even her sacred spaces with her poetry community. And I connected with Sara Moore Wagner a few years ago on a private Facebook group that she and another local poet started to foster support around poetry submissions. I was frankly blown away when she began sharing her published poems with the group as her acceptances flooded in. And I immediately became a Sara Moore Wagner groupie. Again, as with Pauletta, I am struck by Sara's generosity. She shared news of places to submit and showed samples of how she organizes submissions. Besides her stunning talent, I am most impressed by how she champions fellow poets. And also, I have to say, if I'm Sara Moore Wagner's groupie, I'm one of Pauletta Hansel's minions. So before I turn it over to them, I would love Sara and Pauletta. I would love for them to share with us how they found each other in the poetry community and what they discovered about their surprising connection. So Pauletta and Sara.
Thank you so much, Ellen, and also Becca and Lisa and everyone. And I want to just throw out an apology first of all that I am out of my usual element and my bandwidth is low. So if you lose me, I will try to reconnect and come back. And I promise I really do have a face other than just the one on the video. I'm smiling at you right now, and I have a very colorful shirt on that I wore just for this event. Sara, do you want to say something about how we first met, and I'll chime in?
Yeah, so I had seen Pauletta. I feel like I'd gone to events around the Cincinnati area where I've seen Pauletta. She's such a fixture of the Cincinnati writing scene. And when she was poet laureate, she actually put together a lot of posts and websites where she kind of paired poets together who were writing about the pandemic, and spotlights on poet throughout Cincinnati, which is actually my friend Caroline Plaskett just joined, how she and I connected. So Pauletta connects other people together also, but so we hadn't really met or connected on a more personal level until Heartbreak Tree came out, and Pauletta asked me to review it for Still, which Marianne Worthington is here also. I feel like all the people in this story are kind of here to celebrate us together, which is amazing. And after I wrote that review for Still, we kind of realized the overlaps and connections that we both had. And Pauletta so graciously welcomed me. I didn't have much connection with the Appalachian poets or Appalachian writing community. And Pauletta has really opened doors and kind of given me language to speak about my connection to Appalachia on a more deep level, and connected me to that community in ways that are really amazing. So I don't know, Pauletta, if you have more.
Yeah, well, I just want to say that I think I encountered Sara probably originally through her work and through reading poems that she posted as part of a Facebook group that we were in, Facebook group that we were in together, and just fell in love with the work, and then discovered her Appalachian connection through some of the poems and through Hillbilly Madonna coming up. And I just knew that this is somebody that not only that I needed to connect with, but that the Appalachian writing community needed to connect with, and was so grateful when she agreed to review Heartbreak Tree and how she really got it, and just loved that. And am also just so excited now to see that she's published some new poems in Still the Journal, because that was sort of part of my plan with all of that, is to get her connected with that journal and other journals, because we need our upcoming generations of women writers. And I'm just so honored that Sara is part of it. And Ellen, big thanks to you too for all you do in the community and for making these connections.
Yeah, absolutely.
Pauletta, would you mind trying your video for a second? I just want to.
I can try, but it keeps telling me that that I have low bandwidth. But can I just? I'll try it for a minute. See, here I am. See my pretty shirt. I really am alive here. If you would like for me to try to leave it on while I'm reading, I can do that. And then if I go out, I will see if I can't find a better spot. I'm on a hot spot right now, which was working better than the wireless.
Yeah.
So you want me to try that?
Yeah, let's try that for a little bit, just because it's great to have you both on the screen.
I
And
know.
Yeah.
I feel so bad that
I was talking to you, staring at your picture.
that I can't like just smile and say
Yeah.
thank you. So, the internet world, right? So we're gonna read some poems from our two books, Hillbilly Madonna and Heartbreak Tree, as Ellen said, and we kind of set up sort of a shortened version of Girlhoods and Hollers. And we had talked about Sara going first, but Sara, do you mind if I go first while
That's okay with
while
me.
I'm still visible, and then you can add in what we had talked about wanting to do is to read poems where we might be able to talk about sort of the idea of poetic sequences, or specifically, writing new poems as we're putting the collection together. So I have a series of poems that are in Heartbreak Tree that are now each called Story. And a few of them were written before I submitted the manuscript originally to Madville Publishing, but many of them actually came a little bit later, and I was lucky enough to have a publisher who agreed that these poems actually fit. So I'm going to read at least some of these poems. I'm going to keep an eye on the time, and of course we'll keep an eye on whether the internet is working. So, Story. I don't mean to be ungrateful. I was bred for wanting more, the way a racehorse is bred for the wind's scent. Those impossible legs like winged twigs that will snap in a high wind. What moves us onward is the same sometimes as what breaks us to the ground. Here's the story about my grandfather that I don't like to tell. How he found a World War II deserter's bundle tucked inside a cave. How he kept the money, then turned the guy in for a $15 reward. I'm not saying our people weren't hungry. We were always hungry. I'm not saying who my grandfather was is who I am. What my mother wanted was to be far away from where she started. What my father wanted was to begin again. I'm telling you, the hardest thing I've ever had to do is to stop wanting what I already have. And as you'll hear in these poems, the idea of story, it's used in different ways in the poems, but that basically it's taking a family story and looking at it in various ways to try to explicate to myself some of the issues that I'm working with in the poems that make up this collection. So again, Story. My mother said she never asked again who her oldest brother's father was. Granny didn't want to talk about it. That's all we needed to know. So I made stories in my head of someone kinder than my grandpa, his lips not folded thin inside a nighttime scruff of peppered gray. I wanted that comfort for her, if not in life, in memory of a silken tangle of flesh hidden between tall rows of corn back in Virginia where her people stayed. She never went back home, not even after Grandpa died, and finally she cut off her waist-length hair, let her daughter give her a home perm, soft curls around her neck. Years later, almost everybody dead, my aunt told me that old story. A widowed father stumbled drunk, bristling himself into his daughter's bed. Her name was Etta. Before I knew her, 10 children had torn through that secret place her father had claimed. And I'll say about that poem that it was an earlier poem that was written for the collection, and at first it was the only poem that was named Story. And it was the impetus in many ways for thinking about what I was doing with these other poems that had story at their center. I have a mentor, the wonderful poet, Rebecca Gilhowell, and she helped me kind of make this decision around this grouping of poems and how they fit together, not side by side within the manuscript, spread out within the manuscript in order to create these sort of stepping stones from sort of one sort of theme or idea or sort of series of emotions to another. So that was one of the first poems. This next poem, which is actually the next story poem in the book, is one of the last poems that I wrote for this collection, and it really did pick up on a lot of the themes within the book itself, especially the theme of home. When I was a kid and lived just a county or two up Kentucky Route 15 from that place my mother once called home, Granny would come from there and help Mom pick the beetles from her roses, tell her if she'd not gone and got herself too fine to keep some chickens, there'd be no beetles there to pick. But we weren't the sort of family that circled back to what got left behind. And though it's true that home is what I always called whatever hill town my parents were in until they weren't, home got boxed up in a moving van from time to time, houses and towns discarded, snakeskin by the side of the road. So later, when my granny told me what she thought I already knew, that I didn't live up north, I only worked there, I set her straight. I will never move back home. So the next story poem that I'm going to read, I'm actually going to skip one or two of them, but the next one is another one that really does completely tell a story, and it's going back, well, as completely as I can, I guess. It's a story that I have to use my imagination, but I'm going back to an early memory of story and use, in a sense, the child's voice, my own young voice, as I start to try to take it apart. I never understood the story my mother liked to tell to company, how when Grandpa's daddy Felix died that thin night, October 31st, up on his mountain, the animals all threw a fit. The scream of mountain lions, wolves and bears howling whatever kind of clamor wolves and bears make. The next day, tracks led to his cabin door. My mother told it better. I was a town kid. What did I know of wild? She said he was a hunter, and I asked, were they happy he was dead? No, she said, they were showing him their honor. But why? My favorite question. I liked the story of how, when it was time for Deli, the least one, to marry, Felix sent word out and the men came, hats in hand. He had them toss those hats into the open fire, sent the girl home with the one whose didn't burn. This story I understood. Like in all the tales, woman is the prize for whatever man or beast outsmarts the king. My mother loved her grandpa more than I loved mine. He was the tallest in any picture, though we only had the one, holding his Bible, his wife Rebecca in a flowered dress down to her ankles. She died. It was his replacement wife that narrowed Mom's eyes, the one who hid the peppermints when she'd call down the holler for the kids to come and do her chores after she got Deli out of the way. I'd been read that story too, the evil second queen. It wasn't till later that I'd learned to read myself and do some math. Deli was 13 when she was carried off to be somebody's bride. 13, the age that I was too, the first tracks to and from my door. So I'll stop with that poem. I might pick up a final story poem a little bit later, but I just want to say, I guess, a couple of things about, in terms of thinking about that poem and how it picks up other themes. I hope it stands alone within the collection, but also within the collection, it's a way of entering into my own girlhood of early sexual involvement and tangled relationships. And as well as introducing, in some ways, some of the other characters, including me as a character as a stepmother, because there are poems about my relationship, my own relationship of being that evil second queen within the book as well. So thank you, and thanks to the gods of the internet that I got through this reading without going silent, and I can't wait to hear Sarah's.
Thanks, Pauletta. Pauletta and I, as Ellen mentioned, have done so many readings together where we kind of go back and forth, and we decided for this it'd be nice to just take a minute to talk about craft, because that's not something we really do when we do the Girlhoods and Hollers. What we're doing is kind of representing the landscape, representing the difference in generations and the difference in us, really. Pauletta having been born in Kentucky, and me being the offspring of Appalachians who relocated for economic reasons. And really, I grew up in poverty to young teenage parents at the height of the opioid epidemic. Zoom is so weird because I feel like I just am looking at myself. I'm gonna look at Pauletta while I say this. So yeah, we've been doing that kind of back and forth, showing even though our differences are there and the landscape a lot of times is different, we still have this connection of the wild girls, these kind of wild girls who sprang from the hills and Appalachia. So the crafting of our books, as I mentioned, has not been a major point of this conversation, but I love what she was saying about themes and kind of mining and understanding themes that were happening in the collection and then going and writing into those spaces to connect threads, to make a manuscript stronger. And that's a lot of what I did with Hillbilly Madonna. I've said this in interviews before, but Hillbilly Madonna and Swan Wife both started out as the same book, which is kind of why they both happened at the same time. As Ellen mentioned, everything happened for me in 2022 because I just had this large body of work and I was trying to figure out how to organize it. And really, I took all the poems out that had to do with the first year of marriage, and that became Swan Wife. And then I was left with all of these childhood poems and family poems and left wondering, okay, how do I organize this into a collection that says something more than just about me and my childhood. And so I decided to kind of return to the spaces of my childhood. I visited, I looked at family documents, I did research in order to write into these kind of greater themes and kind of pull the lens back from me and the personal in my story, and make it about my father's landscape and about generational trauma, about kind of family, the opioid crisis, all of these things. So I'm going to read some poems that are the poems that I wrote later to kind of fill those gaps. And the first one here, hold on, is Heroin Guzzle. So I wanted to put some form in here, some traditional form, because I was playing with ideas about what a hillbilly is, what a woman is who kind of comes from this land and how much we're supposed to know. I wanted to kind of put myself in the tradition of poetry with some more, and I'm drawn to formalism in general. So this is Heroin Guzzle. Growth has lifted the country that buried sunflower seeds deep into the flesh of every body, buried sprouting seeds, uncurling green as a smile. And if you do that with enough bodies, the ground will begin to part in plates, seeds expanding into blossoms, petaled heads pointing up towards a light until even that light is propagating. It seeds out over the town, over the small church with its graying painted windows, an image from Matthew of the sower and his seeds upon the rocks. And wasn't this such a barren ground before we started planting deep within gunshot wounds, death now seedy, yellow heads pointed always towards God? We will force this, God, into the least of these, the ones who wouldn't grow without a seed on a finger poked into the muscle, just so, placed so shallow, the body disappears. And another poem that was kind of like that is called Gross Negligence. And when researching family documents about my mother left West Virginia after the murder of her mother and her grandmother by her grandfather. And I was looking at documents trying to understand why my grandfather wasn't there. And I found divorce records which cited gross negligence. So I took the word gross negligence and I tried to make some anagrams and explore just that word, because that word kind of stuck deep in me. So this poem is gross negligence. Grandfather, in all your greening silence, you'll never recognize the congress of goslings asleep in your own house. Never slog the long road down to your wife, coil around her, keep her out of the line of fire. Never hold a towel to the bullet wound in her head to stave off necrosis. Never take your daughters into your egoless arms. Never co-sign on a loan, not ever. Grandfather, what did you leave and how stoutly in your own luring, ireless, energetic, full of ice? What did you sling over your shoulder, opening the door to the rest of the wide world, leaving all those open mouths, coring out the center of an apple as you went, gingerly? This one's American Anesthetic. You should keep your pain close as your first Bible, right in the margins of it. Pain is weakness leaving the body, is also a consequence of life as a woman, of the apple, of curiosity. Why wait for a man to come out of the stained glass wall, saint bringer of relief, morphine god, cloth in hand, to cover your mouth until you get what he's selling, relief? Imagine a world where you don't have to feel it. Clawing and gnashing ceased by a slow drip needle, and it's like you're in the world, but not in the world. You watch your baby being pulled out one-handed, and you are laughing. The men from pharmaceuticals come in, and yes, 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 you. The room has a pulse so much like your own. You forget you are dying for once in your little life. That need to forget you are dying for once. I'll read one more of these that I put later in the poem to kind of connect these themes. This one was a more personal one. I was thinking about my grandfather. He was a butcher, and he moved to kind of inner city Columbus and built a little Pentecostal church where he was a preacher. And I went to that church a lot with my Nima, I call her, and him, and this poem came out of me thinking about those moments, and I wanted to kind of bring place even more into this book too. Like the world could bend and fall with us. We saw our fathers go down first, in the aisle of the old church. In the boards we carried on our backs to the cleared fields, we erected, simple and whitewashed, a single steeple. We were given the gifts of the Spirit, speaking in tongues, or a touch of the healing we brought from the chapel into the yard, where we'd lay hands on the red earth of each new grave, lay hands on each little baby brought year after year to the front of the church for dedication and blessing. We sang the holy songs, first from hymnals, then the new projector pastor would roll over the orange carpet, wearing a line of gray straight down the center. How we danced that line, hands in the air, sweat dripping into our stockings and then into our church shoes, clang of cymbal and tap on the keys, pat, pat of feet. Only the best of us would meet the Lord early, would be slain in the spirit, prostrated, overcome, anointed and prone on the floor near the water stain, near the pocked wood pew, nearer to the adoration of the town, of the sky, and then how the Spirit moved in us to speak and speak, to eat the bread, drink the sweet juice decanted into little plastic cups, to touch hands upon leaving. Remember, the Pentecost is the act of the Spirit entering the apostles, what they do with it, how far they go, down to the floor, restored in front of the congregation, walking home like something might be different. So, yeah, really, I think it's similar to what Pauletta was doing with the stories and trying to establish a background for the piece to kind of connect threads. I did a lot of that building.
You did. It's so obvious within the book, the way the seams connect and tear apart and connect again. It's a gorgeous book.
Yeah, same for you.
So I'm not sure if I'm on screen, am I?
Yeah.
I am, okay. I wasn't sure if I was or not. We knew this would happen, that the time would just fly, and it is flying. I feel like we easily could spend the entire time on these two collections. I mean, they're both just incredibly beautifully rendered. But I did want to segue into some other questions that kind of, I hope will, I'm very inspired by both of your work, and most of the audience here are poets and writers. So I'd like to share the inspiration of your thoughts about craft by just asking a couple questions that hopefully will also bring in some of your other work too, beyond these two collections. So I'm going to start with you, Sarah. And after I ask you the question, I hope you can share one or maybe two poems from another collection to kind of illustrate what we're talking about. But I saw that Kristen Noel Kaufman is on here tonight. So this question is related to something I read that you said in this interview in Rumpus that Kristen did with you. So you were talking about your first collection that came out just 6 months before Hillbilly Madonna, I think, Swan Wife, and how you use fairy tales and myth, folklore, Bible stories to interrogate the patriarchal ideas of domesticity. So in this interview, something I found really interesting is you point out that that some of the poems in this collection are personal, meaning the I is the poet, and some are persona. So you talked about how poetry can convey the personal, but not be memoiristic. And I love this quote you pulled in from Marianne Moore. You said that you wanted to build a foundation of poetry, of what poetry is versus memoir, the concept of a speaker, of building, here's Marianne Moore, an imaginary garden with a real toad in it. So can you talk to us about that?
Yes, absolutely. I think for me, a lot of people use that term confessional, and I'm not against confessional. I think that it has shaped me in a lot of ways, the confessional movement of poetry. But I also think that there are other movements. When we talk about confessional, we're talking about the I exposing some kind of deep and unmasked truth, usually traumatic, about the poet herself. And really, I did not come to poetry initially to do that, to kind of take off my mask and show all, here I am. I love language. I love masks. And I'm really drawn to the concept of identity. What even is identity? The kind of fractured nature of what makes us human, especially as women, especially when we become mothers and wives, the layers that are put upon us of what people see just by the titles, what we're expected to be like, and what we are and what we're conditioned to be. All of those things were things I wanted to explore. And so when I think about the personal, I like to think that I come to it more almost like Merwin. I was a philosophy minor in undergrad, so I am a philosopher. I like to think about ideas. I like to pull that in, and some of my poems are closer to me than others, but I don't ever want to reveal which mask is which. I think I do somewhat, but for me, I want to focus in on the art instead of having pick apart, like, what is her life and what is she doing? And is this some kind of confession about who she is? To me, it's about the language and about the craft and about the art and the kind of world that I'm trying to build. So Swan Wife is about my first year of marriage, kind of. But also I kind of had a happy first year of marriage too. It's about domesticity. It's about being a wife. It's about letting go of the wildness to find identity. But yeah, I always want that crafted layer of masking, because I want to pull from that collective knowledge of what builds me, what's built me as a woman. And I want my books to be, even though they're deeply personal, about everyone, about the struggle that kind of we're all going through, interrogating those social norms and foundational tropes. And so some of my personas are very, very close to me, and some are not close to me really at all. So I'm going to read two from Swan Wife that are both of those extremes. And the first one is Dead Wife. And it's kind of built on a Andrew Lang fairy tale of the same title. did I put the page number here? But this is me, and a lot of these poems embodying that stereotypical housewife, the image of what people think I am or what people think I should be. And I use I because I is more powerful. Why not? You know, like I think there's so much power in saying I, rather than she in the distance. I'm going to embody that. So this is Dead Wife. The winter you buried me, the snow fell 1, 2, 3 times over me, and it felt almost like the house we made together, which was always too cold. The house I'd decorate with marigolds I'd grown in the side yard, the ones no one could see. How you'd bring marigolds to my grave, deep orange and pristine. How I could feel you wanting above the layers of separation, above the crystallizing trees, and even above that. How you'd shouted your want into the sky and it held it like a great saucer. Then under the ground, how my hair spread out like a rug, and I rose up as if planted, up like a crocus in the spring, and you picked me and placed me on the table just where I always would sit. Then, in the morning, I'd wake and set that table again and again, 1, 2, 3 times a day, lighting the pilot light in the stove, browning and serving flank steak, chicken thighs, bread. When we lie in bed, I say, don't touch me, or I'm still dead, but you do. You always do. And the snow erases my footsteps like a day. Isn't that always the way? And, you know, I've never had a stove with a pilot light or made steak. I don't cook cows. But just, you know, I enjoy imagining into spaces and empathy that I think poets have. That's why we're drawn to poetry, is that need to feel something that someone else feels. And this one I think is very close to me. The mask is there, but the mask is gone. It's called Housewife as Anastasia Romanoff. There are fractions of moments I forget who I am, like when I'm sitting on the couch waiting out the evening, the clock dialing up each number so slow. I fold my hands as I would a jewel into my hem. And where did I go just then? Identify my body now for me, a long shadow on the wall behind where my children play. I want to escape death as I do my life each night, taking off this skin, stepping into the mass grave of sleep. Even if it isn't me escaping, but some other girl with my same nervous eyes and fake front tooth, some other who will eat all the chocolates with her gloves on, not care about what's spoiled, about the body, identity. What can you identify of me beyond this show I put on each morning, my face? And even when you see my bones laid out, you won't know me. In the evening, I feel that settling or setting. You won't know me, but I'll be the one you look for.
Wow, thank you, Sarah. That's beautiful. I love what you said too about persona, and you know, I do wonder if it gives more freedom as a poet to explore like different facets of, you know, whatever you're writing about at the time. To, you know, your I is not necessarily yourself.
Yeah, I think it does. It gives me a lot of freedom. You know, there's not a lot, for instance, that I know about my family history. And as really, really poor Appalachians, even in Hillbilly Madonna, was allowed or given permission to imagine into spaces. And there are poems in there where I say like my mother was 12 or 13 and I just made that up, and she'll say, you know, she comes back like I was 15, but it doesn't matter. You know, I think there's a poetic truth, and to me that's what I'm doing, is just trying to say that larger poetic truth.
Yeah, I can see that. It's interesting about the philosophy connection too.
Yeah.
But Paulette, I hope that, can you still hear me, Pauletta? Or are you still there?
I can
Yay.
still hear you. I was just trying to save some bandwidth here, but I was listening and taking it all in.
Well, great. I wanted to ask you too about your approach in your, at least your recent poetry collections. There seems to be a much stronger connection to memoir, at least so far. I know we've talked about how, you know, that approach can change with whatever it is that you happen to be talking about. But I know that you've talked about some future collection, a future collection right now that you have persona poems
Mhm.
in, but I found this really interesting. I was rereading the Salon interview, and you were talking about how in Heartbreak Tree it was really important to you to tell the stories now, like to use, I think you used the phrase truth telling, looking back and kind of recounting your memory of the place, and being able to talk about it in a kind of a non-sentimental, non-nostalgic fashion, I guess. So what do you think about this topic?
Well, I mean, I do think that many of my poems are based in story, and in personal story and in family story. And and I was thinking about these questions, and one of the things that I will say is that I, as a young poet, especially, was very strongly affected by the singer-songwriters of the 70s, which was very much a narrative approach, but using story and using the persona of the I, um, as a way of exploring deeper issues in a way, and using music, and obviously both the music of 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 song, but the lyrical tropes of poetry to do that. And so I think we each poet kind of approaches poetry from his or her, down his or her own path, and then finds other pathways perhaps to travel as well. Place is very much present, especially in Heartbreak Tree. But I think within poems that it is harder for me to get away from the narrative, but it's not always, the narrative, the story is not always self. The voice is not always self, and voice is very important to me within poems. But I thought as we were talking that I might read just a couple of poems. One where there is an I that is very clearly close to self, and then another where the I is not self, and just as a way of maybe thinking about that within my own work. So this poem is called Dirt. What people in town remember about my family's home was the dirt in the fenced front yard where no grass could stay grown, worn down by the feet of the kids Mom kept in the daycare where I worked too the summer I was 15, in my shorts and tank top, sitting out on the rock wall that bisected the dirt of the yard from the dirt of the driveway. Once an old woman driving stopped. I don't know how old is old. Maybe the old I am now, older than dirt, carved crevices around her mouth to tell me she once had a waist like mine, steep sloping down, though her ass set up higher. I've been thinking about dirt, or maybe the rock along the road I never noticed I'd noticed growing up there, sandstone and shell striated with coal that always looked wet, even in summer, grass a paler brown than the dirt, which, depending on where in the county you were, might be a gravelly, sandy, stony, silty loam. Maybe she said buttocks. Probably she said butt. I didn't know what to say to her. I had nothing to say. On the road out of town, Kentucky 15 to the Parkway to the highway, an hour to there, and you're almost to Lexington, where there's something to do, not sit surrounded by kid and old and dirt, rough, broken, mountainous, deeply dissected. I didn't know that I knew how the farther you got up the road, the coal is gone. There's clay in the rock, and the grass is greener. I mean, really, it is on the other side. and I think in that poem, as I read it to myself, I can hear three different voices, in a way that there's the voice. It's, I tried to be true to the voice of the girl in my memory. I think there is also, the voice, the grass is greener. I mean, really, it is on the other side, is the adult poet perhaps talking to that girl or to other young poets who are thinking, who are sort of within the feeling of no escape from whatever from whatever that need is. And then the third is sort of pulling in really the geological words that I pulled directly from a paper that I found online about what the rock and dirt was made of in Eastern Kentucky. And that weaving together of voices is something that is really becoming much more interesting to me as I move forward into the next couple of collections. And really it was in Heartbreak Tree as well, that weaving of both personal voice, younger voice, older voice, external voices. But here's a poem where there is an I, but the I is not me. In fact, much of the I was taken directly from a newspaper article in 2019 about the protest, the coal protest in Harlan County, Kentucky. And it's called Harlan County, USA 2019. Maybe it is a revelation to you, but miners know how to stop a train. Maybe you think that love of coal means love of the company. Let me tell you what we love about coal. It's the paycheck, the one we don't have. It's the food that's not on the table, the new backpack that won't be on his back my boy's first day of school, the doctor his granny won't be seeing for her heart. Remember, we're used to the dark. We can see the car on the track filling up the mine you pulled us out of. We can see inside your pockets lined green from the rock we dug for free. And so that is, that is both story and voice, but the poet entering, through persona, as Sara also does, the poet entering the voice, entering another life through another's voice, but the attitude is mine.
Yeah.
The attitude is still the poet's.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I love what you were saying about this is something we've talked about, singers and music, because I think that's evident in both of our works. Pauletta growing up with the 70s singer-songwriters, and I was very obsessed with Tori Amos, and just the lyricism and strangeness and puzzle that Tori, that's what I loved, is figuring out what the hell she was talking about. So you kind of emulate what's around you. Yeah. And I think
You
Lisa
find,
sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, you find what you love to emulate. It's like there's so much we could emulate, but we find those points of connection and move toward those and keep finding them throughout our lives. I think it's not just one mentor, it's so many.
Yeah, and that's like kind of what Lisa was saying about how one collection can diverge from the other too. I've said that so many times about the I in Swan Wife is a different person than the I in Hillbilly Madonna. When I read them, I feel completely like I'm inhabiting two different things, and maybe you feel that way with your collections too.
To a certain degree, I think. I think in a way those voices start to become more integrated within me as I move forward. But yes, I mean, you find different colors within your voice, right? I mean, isn't that what singers always want to be able to do, is to find, new ways of approaching material, all the same voice. I think about my friend Georgella Lyon quoting her singing teacher. You sing with the voice you have. right? I mean, but within that voice, as we begin to develop it, we discover so many different layers within it if we let ourselves.
Yeah. Well, this is a great place to ask this question that Caroline Plaskett dropped in chat. She says, I have a question about something Sarah said about masks and personas. Do you think that the masks get bigger and thicker and better at hiding the more difficult the topic is, or difficult to write about?
I wonder about that. Sometimes when I'm talking about something really difficult and personally difficult, I will remove the mask a minute. There's a poem called A Study on Cracking, for instance, in Swan Wife, which is 100% on the mask is off. I actually gave this book to my doctor because I was like, you remember when this happened? I can kind of read. It's really short. Let me see if I can find it. It's called A Study on Cracking. I practice what to tell my doctor. I have been sad. I am sad. There's nothing wrong with my life. The sun rises gold over the backyard. The dog curls herself into my thigh. At night, I close my eyes and sleep comes easy. In the shower, I think of ways to die like I think of groceries, appointment times. I don't think of ways to die. No, I'm happy. See these lines at the corners of my eyes, how they fork out like flames in the gas burner, how I'm holding it together the way the eggs do the rest of it, the way the eggs turn solid, the way the eggs do. So I think I mask when I'm trying to talk about something that's more of a concept or philosophical idea. But if I want to expose something, then I just say it.
Mhm.
And I think that's, that's sort of the beauty of having a collection, right? or of doing a reading of many different pieces, that you're able to do some of both, that the exposed self, the saying it in conversation with the poems where you may be saying it at an angle, saying it slant, and it's in different poems, different strategies for different needs in a way. And there's more, the truths we have to tell deserve more than one telling and
Yeah.
one way of telling.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I was going, just in the interest of time, I wanted to make sure we got it in some conversation also about, which I think kind of this segues into, about the research that you've done for past collections and for collections that are upcoming. I know that Sarah's Lady Wingshot, for example, has many, I haven't read it yet, but I know there are many Annie Oakley poems, as we've called them. And Pauletta mentioned also a collection she's been working on that, well, I'll stop talking so you can talk. How's that?
Okay. Well, I can start. I have two collections that are forthcoming. One is probably forthcoming pretty far in the future, but it's the one that I'm actively working on now. The other will be out in 2024, and it really is mostly poems that are pulled from ripped from the headlines, as they say. I mean, not entirely, but it is poems that weave in stories that are not mine and speak in voices that are not mine. And so Harlan County, USA is one that I read that is part of that collection. And there's a fair amount about dealing with issues in Appalachia, but using voices other than my own. It's looking at issues of race from is confessional, in that sense, because I'm trying to take a really honest look at my own my own self in relationship to questions of race. And those are poems that were written alongside the poems that were written in Heartbreak Tree, and even the poems that were written in Cold Town Photograph and Friend and earlier books. And so those were voices that did not really fit within the more personal collection, but were, still part of my body of work within this last 5 or 6 year period of time. The other started with some of the final poems that I wrote for Heartbreak Tree, when I started really kind of delving into my maternal family history. And I certainly write a lot about my mother and my grandmother in particular in Heartbreak Tree. But I remembered as I was writing that I had this whole genealogy that was given to me by a dear friend, the late Danny Miller, that traced one line of my mother's family back to Margaret Dawson Roughton Attewell Grimes, who was a Jamestown bride who came in 1621 to not too far from where I am right now. Actually, I'm visiting friends in Yorktown. And so that started me off on a whole long obsession of tracing that maternal line, and through tracing that maternal line, looking at the history of the United States in more general terms, but the settling and the history of Appalachia in more specific terms through the stories of women, the women in my life. So I'm going to read just one poem from this collection, which I'm still researching, and so I'm looking several years out for this. But one of the things that I discovered was that Grandma Margaret had a will and left a red petticoat to her daughter, and her daughter then left a red petticoat to her daughter. And the Jamestown brides came from England with a dowry, which included petticoats, which very likely were red, given sort of the history that I've learned about that time. So this poem is called Red. Thin thread I pull without a needle, a petticoat bought for each maid, 1621, Virginia bound. And yes, it is my fancy, this one red sea-swept petticoat sailed on to 1658, given and bequeathed unto a daughter dead by 1661, and so bequeathed again beside 2 cows, color unknown. So much depends upon a red petticoat, the draggled and red sandy loam, the mucky soil, snagged and patched and blotted stains. This voyaged petticoat more likely slashed to strips to catch the moon-pulled flow, bequeathed to mother, daughter, daughter's daughter, the way my granny, 1968, along the silty banks of Hutchin Creek, stuffed rags between my legs. So that's a sweep of history from 1621 to 1968, using the petticoat.
Thanks, Pauletta. I love that line. So much depends upon a red petticoat. It's great. And Sarah, did you want to?
Sure. Yeah, so my exploration of Annie Oakley really started kind of when the pandemic started, when I had finished both my books, and I was really kind of just tired of talking about myself. I wanted to go into research, and like I've mentioned, all my books contain research. I'm really inspired by nonfiction texts and myth and fairy tales and philosophy, as I mentioned, things like that. So I'm constantly reading as I'm kind of, I think of myself as like, all of us do, a vessel, kind of the words flow through. And but Annie, my mom told me she liked Annie Oakley, and my mom was a champion sharpshooter, and I realized Annie lived like 45 minutes from me. That's where she grew up. That's where her grave was. So I was like, I'm going to start exploring this, and I went to her museum and her grave, and I read like 15 books, and then I read all her newspaper, and it spiraled. I started reading everything about Buffalo Bill and Sitting Bull and the Wild West, and it just opened up to me that it became an obsession, like Pauletta was talking about. It opened up to me. I mentioned the true crime history in my family, that I was really wanting to talk about my mother too, and about gun violence in America, about guns, about the creation of guns in America. I mean, we're surrounded by constant gun violence and shootings, and America was founded on myths about guns. And also, I wanted to explore Annie Oakley was really the first American female superstar. So what she represented for women. And so it is pretty critical of Annie, as well as kind of telling her story that we don't really hear, because she very much crafted her image. So the book is blended between, stories about Annie and her life that are not told, and it moves through history to exploring things like Dolly Parton and Marie Curie and Freud and the Wright brothers and all of these people who are alive. And it turned into, the airplanes turned into bombers, and Sitting Bull and Buffalo Bill, and everything that they represent is what I really got obsessed with. So the reference section of my book is a big long thing, but I think following an obsession is what poetry is about, and this book really took me there. I'm really hoping maybe there'll be something else that grabs me like Annie. It hasn't recently. I'm like praying for another Annie to come my way, but I'll read you one of the poems from there. This is called Even Her Hair Was a Mask. Annie Oakley emerged from a crushed train, from her little carpeted room in the rear car of the Buffalo Bills Wild West Show, Grand American Tour, to chaos and slaughter, carnage of show animals, horses and mules split at the ribs, wood and bone cracked open like walnuts. Of course, she was fine, but limping through the ruins of that great fable of the Wild West, first myth of America, laid to waste and smoking. Annie Oakley, barefoot and in her house dress, plodded through wreckage, charred wood showing age and lines of each cut timber. It was a lie, though, that her hair turned white overnight. No rupture was so transformative. It was always platinum, poured from her head at birth. White spider silk was like corn silk, her mother said, was like clouds, said her sisters, like milk, said her husband, hands in her hair whiter than her teeth and the whites of her eyes. It was unnaturally clean. The powder residue from her first gunshot darkened it. Blood darkened it. Those hands and sooty fingertips raked through it as any tool rakes through the land. When Annie Oakley showed up with a fistful of bodies, squirrels, quail, fat rabbits to sell to feed her mother, her hair was dark, knotted as brambles, curled round like greenbrier vines, prickly and unkempt. Her hair was a thicket she left long on her back to say, "This is what I am now." Brunette and wild and covered complete, every little strand. Like America, I am not who you think I am.
Brava. I know we're almost out of time, or we're going to turn over to the audience participation, but there are a couple of categories we never got to, but I just wanted to take a minute to say how amazing, how honoring it is to women, both of your all of your work. You both address women's identity in different ways, but I'm so appreciative of that. That's so much of a focus of your work. So thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Yeah, so do we have things that folks who are listening would like to speak to?
I'm looking at the chat.
Haven't seen anything come in through the chat recently, but just to flag, if anyone has any questions, now would be the time, or even observations that you'd like Pauletta and Sara to respond to. We'd welcome that as well.
You could also ask Ellen a question. She hasn't
Yeah.
Yeah.
her poetry tonight, but she is also a remarkable poet.
Ellen
Oh,
has.
thanks. I'm early on my journey. I'm just so I feel so lucky to have people like Pauletta and Sarah, to look up to and to see like all the different approaches there are to poetry. It's just kind of I just feel myself becoming more free as time goes on with
Great.
with my writing. I'm not quite there yet, but I'm getting there.
No, you've been really, really making some wonderful poems lately. I've had well, and before as well, but I've sort of, we were out of each other's spheres directly for a while because you were in your MFA program, but now I'm getting to hear more about what you're drafting as you're drafting it, and it's just been a lot of fun. Looks like there are a couple of questions that have come in.
Yay.
Mm.
Well, I could pull one out here. Let's see. It's moving so fast.
There
Sarah,
was,
can
Caroline.
you talk a little bit about who your mentors are?
Oh yeah, and Caroline said, I'd love to hear about both your mentors through these projects. Maybe they're thinking about that with each
and
other.
then yeah, and poetry addressing generational trauma was
Oh
another
yeah,
one.
that would be a good
Yeah.
one too.
Well, I can
So-
talk. Well, I think that question came up because Kelly Moffat is here and in the chat. So Kelly, when I went to graduate school as a single mom about 10 years ago, I had given up on poetry. I was not writing poetry at all. And I wrote a poem, and Kelly was like, what are you doing? You have talent. You need to do this, or else, kind of thing. So she really encouraged. She's kind of I feel like a lot of my poems were written in the quiet hours of the morning while I nursed my children and in quiet spaces. But Kelly really was the one to tell me, aim as high as possible. This was my career path, and you better win everything you can. And I really appreciate that that validation, like Lisa said, and push that Kelly gave me in the beginning, that really made me say, oh, maybe I do have something to give. And then I found a lot of mentors in poets too. Sharon Olds, I remember I asked her once, she was giving a reading, like how she found time as a mom to write, and she told me she would make a little tea clock where she would fill a cup full of tea, and she would tell her kids, like, you aren't allowed to bother me until this tea's gone, and she would call it like the tea clock. And she looked at me and she said, kind of similar to Kelly, like, you have a gift. It is important that you do this. And that's something, as a mom, we feel guilty. I don't know how many of you here are parents, but you feel guilt taking time away from your kids to do something like poetry, especially if you don't know what's going to become of it. So more than anything, the mentoring and people like Caroline and Kristen, I better give you shout outs because you asked me that too, who would, be there to talk to when I'm thinking I'm not going to do anything with my poetry. It's nothing. This is horrible, to say, keep going. It's important to me. That's the kind of connection that I needed for my books, is just that push that it's valid. Yeah. Pauletta,
I've mentioned a couple of them, Rebecca Gale Howell and Georgella Lyon certainly have been two very influential people in my lives, very directly, especially Rebecca, who worked with me on the last two collections, Friend and Heartbreak Tree. But I also, I think we're all mentors to each other, and we need to remember that this is not a hierarchical situation where there's mentors and mentees. I mean, we have to create this web support for each other, and sometimes we do that just by doing our work. And I think about, Georgella Lyon, for example, who was a woman writing in Appalachia when I was afraid to be a woman writing in Appalachia, telling my own story from my own perspective. And, these people that, whether we know them or not, can give us permission. I mean, Diane Seuss is someone whom I've never met, but she's giving me permission as a woman of my age, from a from a working class background, who is writing the truths of her life in a fairly direct way, and using craft, but making memoir from poetry. I came back to writing in a younger middle age, as a woman who was afraid to tell the truths of my life as a younger woman. And so I look for those mentors as well. Ellen, you're a mentor, for sure, and Bonnie and Elaine and Wendy, who are in this Zoom room, who are also doing the work as middle-aged women at a time when it seems like nobody's interested in hearing from middle-aged women, and yet we're telling our stories anyway, and that those stories are a support to me.
That's so beautiful, Pauletta. And Pauletta, you have a beautiful poem about that in Heartbreak Tree, to you. So beautiful.
Yeah.
Will you read this?
Yeah, I would be happy to.
Because I feel like that's exactly what, yeah, this poem is so
Okay.
beautiful.
Thank you. To you. We need all the mothers we can get, I was once fond of saying. And I was talking about me then, mothering all my borrowed girls, the one who wrote me at the end of class, shy as pencil strokes. I pretend sometimes you are my real mother, the one who nested in our love seat, silent but for clicks below her screen, Tuesdays, Thursdays, alternate weekends, until her father drove her to her real home on the other side of town as decreed. I didn't know you back when I pretended longing was enough to make a girl my own. I admit it now. I need all the daughters I can find, the grown ones, fine web of lines around kind mother eyes, who love me for my longing, daughters who are mothers to my words.
Oh, it's perfect. That's exactly what we need to support each other.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pauletta. It's beautiful.
And Sarah, I should also said in that litany that you also are a mentor to me, but I think you already know that. I want to say it aloud on the record for the recording, just in case there's any question of that.
Oh, yes. And I appreciate so much, like I mentioned at the beginning, how you just welcomed me into the Appalachian community. And like I said, giving me language to talk about being urban Appalachian and all of the things that and I really appreciate that kind of passing on of knowledge that I know you said wasn't there for you, when you were starting out, women supporting other women. So it's amazing.
Yeah, Pauletta does so much in the, with the urban Appalachian community. Like, it's incredible. Just watching, as someone who's a transplant to this area, I'm just in awe of the, sometimes a little envious too, of this strong sense of place that lives here. And a lot of that is because of the intention that people like Pauletta have set, to create those strong bonds. So I'm still a beneficiary of it, even if I'm not from this area. I'm still like writing in community with a lot of the Appalachian writers. So, and Pauletta, aren't you impressed that I'm completely converted how I say Appalachia?
I'm grateful to you for that, Ellen, but you need to know that it would be okay for you to say Appalachia. We would still love you.
I'm just so proud of myself.
And upstate New York is really not that much farther from the Appalachian region than Cincinnati is.
Yeah,
really.
There's some similarities for sure, with some of the way some of the communities are, but and I did want to mention too, I don't know if the people heard, I don't think you said this in the beginning, we were so consumed with the technical issues, but did you mention that you just discovered that you were, oh, Pauletta's gone, I think. Well,
oh no, she's there still.
oh, she is? Okay,
Yeah.
she's off of my
Can you hear
screen.
me? Yeah, I was afraid that I was starting to lose it. Not literally, but yeah. So can you hear me?
Yes, but
Okay.
so you and Sarah are,
Oh, we're like,
Oh, like eighth cousins on both sides. Yeah.
that's right.
I just think that's
removed.
hilarious that they discovered that.
Yeah, and I think this is another way she builds community. Like Pauletta really does embrace everyone as if they're, you know, part of her family and connects you in really phenomenal ways. Especially I have felt like I don't really have much connection to writers outside of my little sphere of my home life, and Pauletta has kind of opened that up for me in a lot of ways.
Well, we do it for each other.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, it's been beautiful.
I just want to say we're getting so close to the end, and I wish that time didn't move so fast. I want to ask Sarah and Pauletta to make sure that you scroll through the end part of the chat, because there were some nice notes to both of you. And I really think, I know there was a comment about generational trauma. It wasn't a question. It was more of a, you know, I'm really fascinated by poetry as a way to address generational trauma, which can be so hard to put into words otherwise. I feel like maybe that needs to be another event, because that is such a large, loopy conversation. But for now, I would really love it if everybody who is still here would go unmute yourselves and give Sarah, Ellen, and Pauletta a big round of applause for this evening.
Clap for Pauletta and Ellen.
It's great to see people.
Thanks so much, everyone, for coming, and thanks, Ellen. And this was just such a great opportunity. I feel like we could talk for hours.
You definitely could. Thank you so much, both of you,
We
Sarah and
give,
Pauletta.
Becca and Lisa too.
Yeah, thank you, Becca and Lisa. Thank you.
we've dropped links
Big
in the
thanks.
chat a couple of times so that you can support these poets by buying their books and following them on social media and writing reviews. And you can support us at the Notebooks Collective by signing up for our newsletter. We dropped that link in the chat, following us on social media, and sharing YouTube videos that have been put up on YouTube with a comment on Twitter or your Facebook, so that other people will learn about us and know what we're doing. One more round of applause before we say goodnight to everybody. And applause for all of you for being here on a Monday night. Mondays are hard, y'all.
Yeah,
So thank you for joining us. We appreciate all of you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Have a great night.
Good night.
Thank
Hope to see
you.
you all again.